Good morning and welcome. I have the pleasure of introducing this morning's presenter as we discuss the future of Catholic higher education. A native of Navan, County Meath in the Republic of Ireland, Bishop Paul Tighe graduated from University College Dublin in 1979 with a degree in civil law. Having studied for the priesthood in Holy Cross College and at the Irish College in Rome, he was ordained a priest of the Dublin Diocese in 1983. His first appointment was as parish chaplain and teacher. Later, he went on to study moral theology at the Gregorian University in Rome. From 1990, he was a lecturer in moral theology in the Mater Dei Institute in Dublin, where he was appointed head of theology in 2000. Bishop Tighe has a particular interest in the interface between politics and religion. He was advisor to the Irish Episcopalian Conference on a range of social and ethical issues of national and international importance. In 2004, he was charged with overseeing the restructuring of the Archdiocese of Dublin Communications Office and established the first Office of Public Affairs for the diocese, providing a more effective link between the Dublin Diocese government, public bodies, and non-governmental organizations in Ireland and Europe. In 2007, he was appointed as Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications. In that capacity, he was involved in promoting church reflection on the importance of digital culture and in the launch of some of the social media initiatives of the Holy See. In 2015, he was raised to bishop and appointed to the Pontifical Council for Culture. At the council, where he served as Secretary General, he followed questions related to digital culture, impact of technology on social and political discourse, ethics, and contemporary literature. In July 2022, he was appointed by Pope Francis as a member of the Dicastery for Bishops. And in October 2022, he was appointed as Secretary of the newly established Dicastery for Culture and Education, where he will have particular responsibility for the culture section. Bishop Tighe has been a good friend to ACCU in the short time in his new role. Today, we've asked him to help us understand the recent merger of education and culture within the Vatican and what it means for our work. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Tighe.
Good morning, everybody. At least I think it's morning. I just flew in last evening, so if I'm a little out of it, make allowances, please. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I've known ACCU over the years because on the various groups that visit Rome, I've often been somebody who has met you in that context, and I've learned a lot about your work, and I really am very pleased to have this opportunity to be with you for this discussion. What I'd like to talk a little bit about today is we're in the middle of this merger, bringing together of the Council for Culture, where I previously worked, and the Dicastery for Catholic Education. And I want to invite you to think a bit what it means to put culture on the agenda for Catholic universities. And I don't think it is asking you to do anything new. It's something you're already doing. Catholic universities, for me, are very clearly hugely privileged places for that meeting between culture and the church. For the young people you educate, for the Catholic students and for the non-Catholic students, you in many ways become the face of the church. You are their experience of church. What you do, how they're treated by you, will impact how they're going to think about and understand the church as a reality in our world today. Equally, each new generation of students is coming in from a different culture, is coming in with different sets of values, with different ways of thinking, with different attitudes, different approaches, and you're in a sense at the cutting edge of that encounter between faith and culture, between their belief systems and our belief systems, and in a sense that you're doing. And what we want to do is to encourage you to do that, to continue to do it, to thank you for what you're doing, but also to maybe make it a more explicit part of when you think about your mission, about your purpose. It's about how you might be able to support and encourage this interaction between faith and culture. So I have slides here somewhere, I think. Yeah, nearly forgot them. So the institutional context is a little bit just to say that you're probably aware that Pope Francis has had this commitment to reforming how the Vatican's curia, how its civil service, in a sense, works and functions. And that's important and has led to a number of restructuring initiatives around particular departments. But I think more importantly with Pope Francis is always to see these institutional changes are themselves rooted in a challenge he makes to all of us to be on a path of conversion. At its best, Pope Francis is saying to all of us, whatever our role is, whatever our function is, to try and rediscover the joy of faith, to understand faith as a gift, as something we're lucky to have, as something that gives us a purpose and a reason to be alive, to contribute, to be of service, and to rediscover the joy of that initial vocation. So in a sense, that's a starting point for everything he's saying, particularly for those of us who work in the Curia. It's a reminder of, in many ways, how fortunate we are to have this opportunity to be able to serve, to know the Universal Church, and to learn with the Universal Church. So I'm going to move this part fairly quickly. Predicate Evangelium has brought together Dicastery of Culture and Education. And to say we're getting there. The nominations are happening. There's Cardinal de Mendonça has been appointed as prefect, comes with a very strong curriculum with a background, an acclaimed poet in Portuguese, and also a former vice president of the Catholic University of Portugal. Theologian appointed as secretary, Cesare Pagazzi, who will be focusing very much on the future of theology in Catholic third-level institutions. An undersecretary appointed who is Antonella Sciarone, who comes from Catholic University of Milan, who will be working very much with you, with the Catholic universities broadly. And then I'm there for the culture sector, together with Carla Maria Polvani, who's a specialist on the whole science and technology. And then we have Melchor Sanchez, some of you might know from previous work, who will be looking more particularly at secondary education. So that's the kind of team that's emerging. Logistically, we're in the middle of a move, transporting people from one building to another, and that seems to be going well. Fingers crossed, and let's hope we get there. More importantly, there will be two sections. The document makes it clear there'll be a section for culture, there'll be a section for education. But what we're looking for is a progressive integration of those. And there is very clearly a complementarity between the two. And that's in the document Predicate. The very first thing the Pope says is he wants this to be a department that promotes human values, that supports the development of human values. Those human values being rooted in a Christian anthropology, our understanding of what it is to be human, and also a way of putting people on a path towards discipleship. But I think it's very important to make this point that really it's the human. We're trying to help people to discover, to realize their potential, to realize their humanity, to realize their gifts. And if we do that, then we're also introducing them to the fullness of life, which we believe is revealed in the person of Christ. So that for me, there's a clear complementarity here. Education serves best when we have a vision, when we have an idea of what it is that makes life worthwhile. And hopefully our internal discussion between culture and education will be enriching for both of us. I recognize that a particular challenge, those of you who know education well, know that the Congregation for Catholic Education had a very strong jurisdictional responsibility. It had to approve certain appointments. It's a place of appeal on certain issues. And that's a kind of thing that's been quite foreign to those of us in culture, where we were more involved in trying to promote and advocate. So the work keeps flowing into them while we have to go out there and make the work. So there's this learning that is happening, an intercultural thing within the new department. The second thing I think I want to say is that the whole idea of the reform of the Curia is that the Curia is somehow to be at the service of the Church universally. And subsidiarity is hugely important here. You are the experts in education. You are the experts in education in your own particular context. Your contexts are different. You have different challenges depending on the nature of the institution you're involved with. And we want to respect that. We want to encourage you to deal with the day-to-day life and challenges of your institutions. Where certain issues become common, become shared, become issues that we need to resolve together, then obviously you have the level of your own association here, which is doing that. And if as some of those become global issues, then we try and articulate, draw together people from across the world so we can work out together what a Catholic response to global challenges might look like. And one of my things on that, I think, is at its best, the Curia will be a hub. We're very fortunate. We get to meet people coming through Rome. We get to travel. We learn what's happening in our world. At our best, I think we can become a kind of catalyst. A catalyst enables the reaction, but isn't essential to it. So it's about building the relationships, the networks that will help you to articulate together how, as Catholic institutions, you can contribute to the good of society and to the good of our church. And in many ways for us, the universities have already been on the map. The Council for Culture had memoranda of understanding with quite a number of the universities here present, because we recognize it's in the universities that issue of culture and faith is playing out all the time. And it's happening within your walls and between you and the rest of the world. And in a sense, without wanting to exaggerate, in a sense, we want to recognize the universities have been, in a sense, our local champions. You're the people doing the things we would like to be doing more of. And we'd like to thank you for that and think about how we can do that better together. So at the moment, I would say the new dicastery is learning. We're learning who we are and what we're about. We want you to help us in that. Tell us what you think would be helpful, what would be supportive. We will be asking you to help us. We'll be looking to support you in your work, but we recognize that there are many themes and thematics that we would like to deal with that we would be really pleased if you might be able to help us to advance them. The dicastery will have a staff of about 50, which is large by Vatican standards, but is not huge if you think of the global thing. We won't be able to do this work except in partnership with universities, with other institutions who can give us that ability to interact with our world, and we will need that. And we'll thank you for that. So as I say, this will be a learning relationship. I've no doubt that the relationship between our dicastery and ACCU is going to remain fundamentally important. This is the introduction to the Pontifical Council for Culture. And I put it up there especially because I think it maybe isn't quite what people think about when they think about the Vatican and the Curia. And just for those who don't know, the Cardinal's the one on the far right of the photograph. This is just one event I've chosen to talk about, which was an event on Catholic imagination, which was responding to the idea of how fashion and religion have interacted through the years. It was a bit of a high risk for us to get involved with it, but it was an extraordinary learning experience. The museum in New York, who sponsored this, were very clear that it was one of their more successful ventures. And why it was successful was you had people from faith communities coming because they were interested in the religious exhibits, who were then having their eyes opened to questions about beauty and art and design and dress and the function of cultural issues. You had people who were coming for cultural purposes who then found themselves having to ask questions about what religion is and how it's about. But there was risk involved. There was risk involved because we hadn't known about the gala ball. We didn't realize Rihanna would appear as the Pope, and this wasn't quite it. But we also realized in any encounter like that, there's risk both ways. There's risks for artists, there's risks for designers in even being associated with a church that doesn't have universal celebration by all sectors of our society. To push that through a little bit, I just want to make the point that it's part of, I think, the council was born from Vatican II. Vatican II had this idea, the church has to open towards the world, journey towards the world. It does that by having a council that deals with other Christian faiths, having an area that looks at interreligious dialogue, and also established at that time a secretariat for non-believers. And that remains fundamental to our identity in the Council for Culture. Somehow, and in the culture sector of the new dicastery, how do we interact with those who in the past were called non-believers. Not the happiest of language, I'll say. Better language in the document Predicate Evangelii, which talk about people who don't profess any particular religion, people who don't identify with any creed, or a term that Pope Benedict, where he said, those for whom religion is something foreign. Many people have very good will, but don't identify with the religious creed. How do we engage with them? How do we work with them? How do we learn from them and with them? The Council for Culture itself, then formally established in 1982, reinforced in 1993, with a mission to kind of understand the culture, understand the world in which we're living, the value systems, the attitudes, the approaches, so that the church can have an appropriate presence in that world, that we can speak a language that people understand, that we can promote values that speak to them in so many different ways. So this very interest as ours is to promote what I would call a culture of encounter. How does the church really meet with, engage with, and have positive interaction with people who are coming from different places? Part of that is also, and I'll come back to this later, is intercultural. It's not just about layering up, recognizing there are different cultures and we leave them there. It's to recognize that at its best, culture is something dynamic. There's an interaction, a mixture of cultures, and that those cultures can enrich our world. And that a dangerous thing is to try and somehow set and cement a culture as if there won't be. Cultures are dynamic. People are learning, we're developing, we're growing in insight. And the more diversity and difference we can bring to that, that is going to be a richness for our understanding of who we are and what it means to be human. The background to some of this, Vatican II, I'll move through this quickly because I'm going to presume a certain familiarity with it. The church and the world. The church lives in the world, and there is a mutual exchange, a living exchange and assistance. We have, thankfully, something important to share with our world. We have a very good news. We have a person of Jesus Christ to share with our world. But we also have things we can learn and take from our world. And Vatican II tried to get that sense of we give to the world, but we receive from the world. The Spirit is present in our world in places that will surprise us. And to have this attentiveness to where human beings are flourishing, somehow God is present. And how can we be alert to that and celebrate that? One of the terms I like to pick up recently is it's a bi-directional learning. We have something to teach, we have something to learn. Pope Francis always very strongly, we're a pilgrim church. Our faith does not give us an exemption clause from the realities of life. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card where we don't have to worry because somehow we'll be transported miraculously to a better world in the future. We are to be committed to working with others to make this world a better and more just and peaceful place for all with whom we share it. There's no exemption. We share the concerns. We try and go beyond ourselves, not focus on our own issues, but to be responsive to a broader world that we're responding to. Pope Francis, the first time I ever met him was at a talk he gave us about social communications. And at the time he said, I want the church to do three things, which has remained my personal mantra. I want you to listen. Listen to the world. Listen to understand what are the concerns, what are the nervousness, what are the hopes of people. Then he said, I want you to converse, to engage in a proper conversation. And finally, I want your whole work, your defining term, to be a word of encouragement, to give people, it's a difficult world. Let our faith, our source of joy, be a joy for others. Two perspectives just coming from that I'll mention again very quickly. Pope Francis always wants to bring out this notion of the unity of the human family. For many people in our world, other people are an unfortunate reality that they kind of feel they have to accommodate because we share this space together. Many of our understandings of society are based on notions of, well, interdependence, but they're weak, they're not strong, they're about tolerating, they're about the minimum kind of enlightened self-interest I need to have to make allowances for others so they leave me space for myself. Our Christian anthropology says we are social by nature. It's intrinsic to us. We are sons and daughters of one God. We're not simply interdependent beings who share a planet. We have responsibility, and we will either thrive together or not thrive at all. The notion of common home we see very Francis building with that, Pope Francis building this notion of how we take responsibility for our fragile planet, how we work together to make this a more secure planet for all of us. And as you know, the attractiveness of that part of Pope Francis's commitment to our younger people in our education is important. One thing I think also very important here is, and I think if I was to say the original sin that Pope Francis identifies is that of inequality. The inequality of economic means, but the inequality of political opportunity that goes with that, but also finally a kind of an inequality that's emerging in our world, almost of destiny. Some people are destined for success, others are going to be losers. A world where there are winners and losers is totally inimical to the thinking of Pope Francis. We don't discard, we don't leave behind, we try and battle those forms of inequality, which you will also have to confront in your own institutions. Cultural framing is, if I was to ask you to think about your mission and your work through the lens of culture. The definition of culture, I don't like reading long quotes, but it's not particularly long and it is worthwhile. It's a quote from Fratelli Tutti, where Pope Francis says, "The word culture points to something deeply embedded within a people, its most cherished convictions and its ways of life. A people's culture is more than an abstract idea. It has to do with their desires, their interests, and ultimately the way they live their lives." This is a kind of a sense that we need to have. Who are we dealing with? Who are we working with? What is their understanding of normal? I think also we need to realize most of us, and particularly the students, are coming from different cultures, from a variety of cultures. We're not just one culture. And to have that alertness to how we think, what are the influences that shape our ideas, our expectations, our hopes, our mission, and how do we work with that? One of the questions I'd like to put to institutions is, and particularly to Catholic universities, is one that's about asking a question about, to what extent are you shaped by your culture, by the third level university culture of the US, and to what extent are you shaping that culture? And I think it's a question for you to hold. You can't not be shaped by it. You cannot ignore the economic realities within which you work. You cannot ignore parental expectations. You cannot ignore the demands of students. And yet at the same time, you're trying to keep your own originality, keep your own vision, your own ideals, your own hopes for education, to keep that alive. Many of you belong, and I think it's not just Catholic, it's about the particular charisms of your founders, the particular priorities that you have. So how do you keep that alive? And I think one way of thinking about that is this: am I shaped by culture, or am I able to shape it? Am I making a contribution, or am I just responding? Partly that I want to say is, it's a filtering. Within any culture we live in, we should be capable of recognizing the good. Affirm the values of a culture, particularly affirm the values of the young people with whom you're working. Many of the young people you work with have extraordinary levels of sensitivity to the importance of climate change as an issue. They're much more attentive to questions of equality. They're much more sensitive to a reaction against any form of discrimination or intolerance. Let's learn from that, let's affirm that. I think it's important. It might come from Ireland, and very often we're lamenting what has happened, the great religious tradition. But it's very interesting at times to see so many young Irish people are turning up in NGOs, development work, and human rights organizations, in a sense being a type of missionary that would have been the hallmark of the Irish. So let's see where we can affirm, what we can affirm in society. There are things in our culture and in the culture of the young people you're working with that will raise concerns for you. But let's do that with a spirit of love, not of judgmentalism, not of superiority, but of being able to show a concern that maybe we have a wisdom that certain attitudes, certain approaches, certain dimensions of their culture may not be helpful to them. I'm not going to itemize that. I think you know it's always interesting to listen to university people talk about what are the fragilities and the vulnerabilities of the students today, but to respond to those with warmth, with hope, rather than simply seen as a negative or reproval. The Catholic issue, again, is where is identity? It's really reassuring to hear the Secretary talk about, we notice your Catholic schools, you're graduating more people, and you're attending to the needs of those who are less welcome. Let's celebrate those achievements. Let's work with, I think, as a moral theologian, there was a long debate on what is it that makes Catholic moral theology different to anybody else's moral values. And it's not so much at the level of content. I think in your universities, within your own context, you have to and will be committed to the excellence of the education you deliver. That is the sine qua non. You won't be credible if you're not delivering, and excellence is relative. Excellence is what you can deliver with your resources. It's what you can deliver to particular students. But it's particularly the ethos of that is we're not just interested in the high performing. We're not just interested in those who are seeking to be credentialized to get to the right side of that inequality barrier. We're somehow working particularly to try and promote a sense of attentiveness. And again here, I think we recognize what we learn from outside our tradition. I see lots of the Catholic universities, it's been new to me, is learning about diversity, equality, and inclusion, which has perhaps come from outside, but it's something that should be fully resonant with our values and our commitments. Just one or two things. I think one thing that Catholic education will want to stand for is a notion, an integral or holistic understanding of education. It's about a formation of a person. It's about equipping them with a vision of what it is that make life worthwhile. It's about equipping them with a sense of their own dignity and worth that is not contingent on their achievements, that is not contingent on the money they make, that is not contingent on how many social media followers they have. We live in a world where young people are expected to perform, to demonstrate, to prove, to achieve. Let's somehow reassert their intrinsic goodness and value and break them from that kind of consumeristic pressure that is so strong and so felt for many young people today. I think in that context we need to watch more reductive understandings of education, which are all about the measurement of outcomes. I worked, as I say, in a small university in Dublin. I think the most depressing day was when we merged with a bigger university, and every course had to be evaluated for learning outcomes and for transferable skills. And it was a game we played. It had no intrinsic value. It got us through a process, and it delivered something important. But I think, and we may have to play the games at times, but at least let us know their games. Don't get totally trapped on the measurement. I think the functionality one is that everything has to be shown to have a financial outcome. I think we need to resist that. And I think we need to watch this thing that education is modular. We can give you a little bit now and a little bit later, and we can give you a skill now, and we can unbundle everything, and you will collect various certificates, and at the end of it all, you'll have the employment you need. I think we need to be resistant to those. We need also, even when we're in competition with each other, to have an agreed way of working and thinking together so that we don't get a going to the bottom or a race to the bottom. Finally, I want to raise just, and this is my final couple of points, will be, I think, a particular crisis which is very clear in the culture today, which is the crisis, in a sense, that exhibits itself in the extraordinary polarization we have in society today, in the fragmentation we see in politics and in culture and in so many aspects of life. And it's something that I think we need to think about and respond to. One Dutch theologian, I think, put it very nicely, Henk Witte, when he said, there's a danger that we blame everything on digitalization. He says digitalization has to some extent exacerbated differences and maybe spread them out into wider publics. But he would argue that the ultimate root is the inability of a society, of a community, of a public, to be able to share certain values because we can't agree on one account of the good. What is it that makes life worthwhile? What is it that contributes to a healthy and well-functioning society? What are the stories we tell ourselves that fire our imagination and fire our young people to different? So in some way, what he would argue is that the real crisis is a crisis about actually finding truth, meaning, and purpose in life, and a shared account of that truth, meaning, and purpose, where then we're left only with identity politics. I will hang myself with one group. I'm going to go with this group. And we get caught in the cocoons where we can't talk to each other, where we can't learn from each other, and where even at times engaging with somebody who's different is seen as a betrayal of our group. So there's something there. He also makes a point, Pope Francis, that I think is interesting. He talks about in that context, when nothing is clear, where there's no shared vision of what life is about and what it is that makes our lives worthwhile, the danger is by default, everybody decides he or she has to look after him or herself. That we become, how will I, and a type of individualism, consumerism, becomes the default story that makes purpose of life, because this society is difficult, and it's everybody for him or herself. And that happening by default. Nobody would, I think, want to buy that or name that as their value system, but it can happen by default as a protective mechanism. So the cultural charter, I think Pope Francis would like to invite universities, Catholic universities, Catholic institutions generally, to begin to respond to this reality of polarization. And I think Fratelli Tutti, just mention some of this. Fratelli Tutti, I think, is particularly chapter 6, is where he addresses some of these issues. Pope Benedict, as we know, was very strong on addressing relativism, and particularly the intellectual legacy that came from relativism. Pope Francis is more concerned with what he calls practical relativism, the idea that people build their own lives for themselves, and anything that's not of value to them, or any person who's not of value to them, or any institution that's not of value to them, should be discarded, and we just push ahead and protect ourselves, or the more powerful institutions work in their own interests. So in addressing that, Pope Francis, I think, raises and puts out 3 ideas that I think are important. The first one is, how do we rebuild, how do we refine, how do we rediscover some measure of consensus that is rooted somehow in things that are true? His second concern then would be to promote the importance of dialogue as the instrument through which that consensus may be reached. And then finally, that dialogue has to form a style of life, what he calls a culture of encounter. So just to take those quickly, Fratelli Tutti is interesting because he has this notion that if we want to find consensus, that there are shared values that make human life worthwhile. If we dig deep enough, there are approaches to living that promote the development and the well-being of individuals and of society. And that if we work together, we can begin to articulate some of those. He's very clear that it's not the consensus that makes them true, but it is the consensus that will help us to find those. Some of you who work in the area of moral theology will probably recognize what I see in such here as the old natural law method, reflecting on what it means to be human, of what it is that promotes human flourishing, what it is that makes life worthwhile for the individual and makes life sustainable for society. It is possible to find a level of consensus, of agreement that certain attitudes, certain values, certain approaches are going to be more conducive to human well-being, and others are going to be destructive of that. But I think what Pope Francis is doing is he's rehabilitating natural law by saying this is the method. But let's be clear that our understanding of what it means to be human has to be truly inclusive, has to be much more inclusive than maybe our tradition, where our tradition has been a natural law theory rooted in Western intellectual tradition, rooted very often in the male perspective, and even within that shape maybe very particularly by a male celibate perspective. So how do we broaden out an understanding of what it is that works, that makes our lives worthwhile, that gives value and purpose to our life, in ways that we can share that with a broader community? And for Pope Francis, this is all about dialogue. It's about searching for consensus with inclusivity, and it's radical inclusivity. For Pope Francis, he's lovely stuff where he says, tension is good. Diversity and difference is a richness. We have to create safe spaces where we can learn from each other, where we can talk about what it is that really makes life worthwhile. he also has the sense that dialogue, often when we hear the word dialogue, we think dia has something to do with two, that it's two words. No, dia is ultimately about deepness. It's about the ability to go that little bit deeper. The things that cause us to differ, the things that make us contentious with one another, can we get beyond those and find the points of purpose where we find something in common and shared? And that for Pope Francis is not simply a technique. Dialogue is a technique, but dialogue is much more a commitment. It's a radical commitment to understanding that the other person has something of value to say, that my truth will be enriched by the truth of the other, that we commit together to searching for truth. He doesn't pretend this is going to be easy. He doesn't pretend this is going to be simple, but his commitment is to working this out through how we see and envisage the other person. And I think it's a jump of imagination that's required here. If the person who I've decided is different, represents the other side, is not perceived as somebody like me, but is always perceived as a threat, as an enemy, as competition, then this ain't going to happen. We need to recover this sense of discovering the uniqueness and the shared nature of what it is to be human. The stories that we can tell that talk about our shared humanity, that enable us to see the other as having something to say. That's why I had the picture there of Pope Francis on the island of Lesbos, at a time when people were talking about migrants as invading hordes who are putting at risk the economy of the Western world. Pope Francis went there and stood in front of children, mothers, families who were broken and said, these are like us, we need to respond. So it's that jump of the imagination, the art of the encounter he's constantly talking about. We don't just meet people. It's not just a physical interaction, it's actually a hope of learning. And then one other thing I think on this is, on the dignity and worth is an important issue to talk about. Particularly Pope Francis has this idea that a basic truth is of the one he won't concede ever, is he said, basic human dignity is an intrinsic worth of every person. I think there we need to work with the human rights community to find a way, at a time when human rights themselves are being questioned by many who want to relativize and project human rights as somehow only a Western invention, to discover this sense of dignity and value intrinsic to every human person that our world needs. And finally, and I'll lead on this point, is that Pope Francis then, in Fratelli Tutti, moves beyond all the intellectual speculation and moves on to what he says, we need the recovery of kindness. This is almost like a charter for your institutions for our world. He goes from the high blown and he says, our institutions, our civil institutions in many ways have been coarsened and brutalized. We need to recover them by being kind. And he gets into very detail, the smile, the tenderness, the response, the making time for the other person, so that we counteract the almost creeping individualism that threatens our institutions. So this idea of a kindness, giving attention to another person, being attentive to them as conquering individualism. And finally, all of that charter, as I say, is going to be important for our world. But I want to relate it to a similar task for our church, which is the synodal process. Synodal process is a high-risk strategy. It's inviting people to come together who begin with different perspectives and different approaches and sometimes different values, but with a shared faith. And if we can make that happen, it's a contribution not just to the church, but to our world as to how we can make good communication happen and overcome the barriers and burdens of our society. Thank you so much.